Well, welcome to another edition of AP's Profiles in Christian Living. My name is Mark Powell. I'm the convener for the National Journal of the Presbyterian Church of Australia. My special guest with me today is Dr. Marshall Ballantine-Jones. Marshall has his doctorate in the very thorny and sensitive topic of pornography. And today we're going to be talking to him about its societal impacts, as well as personal challenges and solutions to help us navigate this very sensitive topic. Marshall, welcome. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, I always ask my guests this as a first question. Tell us a little bit about your own journey to faith in Christ.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I grew up as a pastor's son in a Sydney Anglican church. My father, Bruce Ballantine-Jones, well known in those circles, and it was a really vibrant church. I was there from 3. I left when I got married, which was 24, so most of my early years were there, and it was a lot of young people, a lot of exciting, dynamic evangelism, enormous youth ministry. The work of Cameron Hislop, who's been the long-standing youth minister there, has been legendary, and so many, literally thousands of kids around my time and then since became Christians, and many went through to ministry. So it was a dynamic environment. I would say that I was always Christianized. I always, in my mind and heart, as far back as I can remember, believed Jesus was Lord. And so I don't have a light bulb like conversion story, but I know in my adolescent years, I did go somewhat wayward. I certainly, as the youngest of the household, the youngest of the minister's kids, felt I had something to prove, and I did push boundaries, and I did play up, and I did act completely contrary to the Christian lifestyle, particularly with drinking and girls and partying and some drugs and so forth. And so it was probably towards the end of school that through the mentoring of the leaders at the church, Ed Vaughan, for example, well-known minister, the chaplain at the school I went to, Mr. Abbott Smith, I was shepherded back into taking the Christian faith personally. And by university, I was certainly in the ballpark of owning my faith and wanting to live as an adult for the Lord. And interestingly, I went to a conference in my first year at uni with our church. It was just during a holiday break. It was put on by the Baptist Union at Bankstown Town Hall, and they had a visiting preacher named Rick Warren that no one in Australia had heard about at the time. It was 1993, before all the purpose-driven stuff. And we went along there because it was all about church growth. My dad was wanting to get some new ideas and think about this more. I was his musical director. I went completely indifferently. And yet I was blown away by young Rick Warren's zeal, story, passion. I had a chat with him in one of the breaks, just wanted to run some ideas past him. And he challenged me very pointedly that if I believed in the resurrection of Jesus, if I actually believed that happened, give a reason why I shouldn't be dedicating my life to telling people about that. He challenged me on that score, and I couldn't come up with an answer. And it sat there for some years until eventually I thought, well, I should take this further and ask some questions. So I went to a Bible college interview at Moore College, and from there, the doors just kept opening for ministry. And so I became an Anglican minister, worked in a couple of parishes, then worked for YouthWorks as the publisher for the Anglican Diocese for some years, and then the topic of porn found me, and that's taken on a whole new beast.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because my son, whom you know as well, is studying history, and he says to me often, Dad, you wouldn't know how many times the world has changed because somebody did or didn't pick up the phone. Have you had that sort of phone call moment that changed your life?
Actually, literally. So what happened was I was sitting at my desk in the publishing office 2013, and I got a phone call from a friend who was in the upstairs office with the professional standards unit. This is a lady from my church. She said, "Oh, look, Marshall, we've got a meeting starting in about 5 minutes, and we forgot the youth department. Everyone from the diocese is there, but no one from the youth department. Can you come up?" I said, "Well, what's it about?" She says, "It's about pornography and ministers." And I kind of like, "Why are you calling me?" And she goes, "Well, it doesn't matter. Just come on up. We need someone." So I wandered up there, and walked into a meeting that was packed with the who's who of the diocese. We had all the therapists and sexologists and psychologists and academics. We had bishops' assistants and lawyers and trainers, and they all were there to deal with the question that was asked at the introduction by the chair, which was, to what degree is pornography a problem for senior ministers? And without going into details, it became immediately apparent a disconnect in that answer, a disconnect between those who were in the therapy arena and those who were in the church leadership arena. They couldn't agree, and they actually had a robust argument about it. And as the conversation progressed, I'm still at the sort of back end of the long table in that boardroom, just being inconspicuous and quiet because I didn't feel like I fit in place. I did put my hand up to make a comment, and I just suggested that perhaps rather than arguing, why don't we get some answers? Why don't we do a study? And the chair said, well, that's good. Could you do that for us? And so all of a sudden I was sucked into the vortex of researching pornography. And well, we did a survey of all the church workers in the Anglican diocese, not just the vocational and senior ministers, lay workers, gardeners,
And what were the results of the survey?
Well, short of it was they were confrontingly bad. They, in many of the sub-age groups, there was no distinction to the secular world. And it was a sobering moment when we got those results in. We also asked those in the survey, to what degree would they like to trust someone for help? And we gave them a whole list of options. And what became apparent that those in ministry were far less inclined to disclose this to someone else in their profession, particularly a leader above them. The closer that person got to the sort of the hierarchy of the actual denomination, they became less reluctant to disclose. Obviously, that's because of shame and also because of fear of the consequences. It just put the situation to a more urgent scenario. We have a problem and we don't have people willingly want to deal with it. And so with that, we concluded some solutions were necessary, but we didn't know what the solutions would be. Because when we opened up the peer review literature for some secular advice, there was no best practice standard, no studies about how to effectively reduce pornography behaviours, and there were no systematic guidelines for religious organisations either. So this actually spawned the next question, how are we going to get those answers? And I was tapped on the shoulder by my old mentor, Patricia Wirracoon, sexologist. Many people know who she is. She said to me, young man, the rest of us are not in a situation to pursue this research, but you've still got some time on your hands. So why don't you consider enrolling in some postgraduate work? And with some questions from there and some introductions to people, I ended up spiraling down to the medical school at Sydney Uni under the tutelage of Dr. Kim Oates, and did a extensive study on the effects and the solutions to the problem of pornography on younger people. And that all came about because someone called me with 5 minutes before a meeting saying, come up, with no plan at all. So it felt so random, and yet it's clear to me and my family and to those who I've been working with here that this is God's hand on this, because we have a massive issue. We need more people to address it. And so here I am.
Wow. Yeah, it's such a massive issue, like you say. And I think I've heard you say in seminars, some of the findings were 40% of senior ministers were accessing pornography on a monthly basis.
Yeah, and some nearly 60%, above 50%. And there's been some studies from America, much larger sample sizes, of clergy in evangelical church circles, and also junior ministers, youth ministers, and we're finding that the stats are the same. And I think it is fair to conclude that what we observed in those studies and what we're getting from America would be generalizable and true for other denominations, smaller denominations in Australia, Sydney, Tasmania, and so forth. The same problems everywhere. And the challenge, therefore, is how do we come up with some solutions that can be applied not just in our own domestic areas, but other places as well.
Before we talk about the solutions, because I know you've got it, you've developed a really good course called Resist, but you've also going around talking in schools and doing seminars. But before we look at the solutions, do you see that, first of all, is it more of a problem today than it was, say, 50 years ago before the advent of the internet, social media?
I think absolutely more of a problem. One of the things that has driven the increase in negative behaviours related to online sexual material has just been the access, the increased access, and also the degree of what is being accessed, both in terms of the content, the nature of it, and also the frequency of that. So one of the catalysts for this change has been the smartphone, and another one has been broadband internet. Now, they both really converged at the same time in the history of technology. What it meant was that people went from being able to sporadically access pornography, often in print, maybe DVD video, to now being on broadband internet. It's just a much higher frequency. What's more is parents are giving kids phones at an earlier age, so kids are getting exposed at a younger age than historically would have been true. So the frequency's increased, the age of first-time exposure has got lower. So they're two big challenges, and really the nature of pornography has changed in the last 30 years. What went from what we might today call soft porn, which is more erotic, titillating images, we now have content which is traumatic, confronting, and mainstream. And although I never recommend this to anyone, if you by chance happen to stumble across the landing page of one of the main porn sites, the content that you would see there, particularly if you're a young kid, is just traumatic and sticks with people. And so when you multiply those initial exposures regularly, we've got teenage boys who are looking at this stuff every night in their bedrooms with no boundaries, no restrictions. This is shaping them. This is making them more sexualized, hypersexualized. And what it's converting to is a massive shift in sexualized behaviors amongst young people, not just in interest and not just earlier age of first-time engagement, but because people's behaviors are mirroring what they're consuming, we're now seeing a lot more violence in the sexual interactions and romantic interactions amongst young people. We see a lot more harassment of girls, especially. It seems to be more one-way traffic from the boys to the girls. But at any rate, we're seeing a lot more overt and confronting sexual material and education that is shaping this next generation.
So I remember you saying in a seminar recently, I think it was Patricia Weerakoon was giving a seminar at a boys' school, and in the midst of her presentation, a boy yells out, "What's the problem?"
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And you said that she said she was quite shocked because up until that point, it was assumed as a community that, okay, it was a guilty pleasure, right? But you still felt guilty. Now there's less shame.
Well, when that person interrupted her talk, and he said, "What's the problem?" And she asked, what do you mean, young man? She said to him, he goes, "What's the problem with porn?" And the whole audience erupted in cheering for the boy when he said it's just a problem, it's just a bit of porn. And that's when she realised how normalised porn had been, when all the kids just applauded without any conscience or any problem with that attitude. And that's one of the markers of a big shift in the current generations. Sexualised standards are so normalised now.
So knowing what you know now through all your research, if you could answer that boy or that class and say, okay, here's the problem, how would you outline it?
Yeah, so I very quickly would go to town convincing the person who held that view that it is harmful to them. And there's a lot of evidence for that. And so I might rattle off some of the ways that it's harming him, from his brain, his body, his sexual functionality, and of course his thinking, and then the behaviors that come from that. That's very rich amount of evidence to support that harm. But I also want to lift the eyes up from just the navel. I just don't want this to be an argument about me with the person saying, well, this is bad for you, because a lot of young people today just will reject that advice to start with. They don't care if something they're doing is harmful because it's no one else's business, and they'll deal with that in their own way. So there needs to be a bigger response than just how it's affecting the user. And so I very quickly argue about what it's doing to the world around them. I talk about the societal effects. I talk about how when you engage with pornography, you are using miserable stories to give yourself pleasure. The people who perform in these productions, they are disadvantaged people. They are people who have come from enormously vulnerable and traumatic backgrounds. They're people who aren't there willingly. They're there because they're desperate. They're financially desperate. They have much higher rates of mental health struggles, of suicide risk, of STIs. They have a very difficult chance of being re-employed elsewhere outside of that industry afterwards. They can never leave the industry technically because their materials are constantly revisited by others. And so they say the average period that a performer spends online in the industry is 3 months. Only 3 months before they leave. They cite that it was generally highly traumatic and abusive in the actual experience, but they don't really leave it because for many, many years onwards into perpetuity, their materials are revisited by people. And so I got to let that boy say, you know what, mate, you think porn's not a problem. It's just a bit of porn, but every time you use it, someone else has to suffer. And what happens if it was a person who long ago turned from it? Maybe it's a person who became a Christian. Maybe it's a person who's just trying to get on being a mother, and yet you constantly hold them to that past. It's an awful, cruel, enslaving, unloving way to treat people.
I've heard you say too, one of the things that really gets through to a teenage boy is the problem of erectile dysfunction.
Yeah.
Is that the sort of, I guess, wake-up call that actually this is actually having a terrible effect on them personally?
So the research is consistently and even increasingly supportive of a much deeper effect on people's sexual capacities once they're a high-end porn user. And teenage boys do not like to hear that they're actually investing in bad sexual function. But it probably gets a little bit more than that. And this is probably the third thing that I'll reason with these kids is that they all aspire to a good sex life in the future. And partly they've been fantasizing about this. Many of them, they'll fantasize it for 10 years before they even kiss their first girl, right? And so they've invested in so much thinking and anticipation. But what we know is that when you actually have your first time sex experience, that it's vastly different to what you thought it would be. It more often than not it doesn't work well, and certainly emulating pornography sex can be both dissatisfying, if not traumatic, especially for the females. And then more broadly, it correlates with dysfunctional relationships. The relationships are much poorer when the porn's involved. Each round of research has shown this. It's the porn-free monogamous married relationships which report the best sex lives. So the boys need to know this, that they're investing, and girls as well, they're investing in an unhappy future. And so I hope that when I put all those arguments on the table and reason them, give them examples, that I can persuade more of them to actually rethink about their private habits, at least get them to think that this is not just a benign and indifferent sort of recreation.
Okay, let me give you a devil's advocate question.
Sure.
Because I can imagine some people, at least in a high school seminar setting, say, but what about a platform like OnlyFans, right, where it's a monetized platform? You see stories in the newspaper about people making lots of money out of it. It's on their terms. It doesn't have the same kind of physical interactions.
Cuts out the middleman. Not as exploitative. They're in control of their material.
How do you respond to that?
Well, it's demonstrable, very easily demonstrable, that those claims aren't true. Even in the genre of OnlyFans, what they call the webcam business, where the participant is really having a direct relationship and engagement with their viewers, we know that only a tiny percentage of them actually make money out of it. The vast majority, a massive long tail of people trying to make it in there, do not make money, runs at a loss, and yet to compete with the others in those platforms, they've got to subject themselves to all sorts of degrading activities in competition with the others to get attention. So it actually basically repeats the same story that happens in all other forms of traditional porn, and just widespread exploitation, widespread misery, complete deception. And of course, people who finish even in the OnlyFans arena will report that it was traumatic, that it was regretful. And so we just got to call out the truth here that there's no form or no arena which is ethical and which delivers a benefit, or that's in the interest of those who participate, and that somehow avoids contributing harm to others. Sure, there's a scale. There's some forms of pornography which are just diabolically abusive, like, for example, child pornography. But just even the more benign, user-friendly type of, like OnlyFans, leads to exactly the same outcomes for those involved.
Yeah, I heard you say too that it really is a slippery slope where you start off over here, but then to get that next high, you've got to like go lower in terms of what your personal values might have been. You'd think I'd never go there.
Well, yeah.
And yet a couple of years down the track, there you are.
Well, I mean, part of this is the function of the brain. We know that as you engage in something that involves a lot of dopamine, which sexual arousal does, that your brain adapts. It gets very quickly bored of the status quo. The receptors that absorb dopamine reduce. They're not used to having so much. And so you get put into this death spiral of trying to get a previous high. But to do that, you have to up the activity. And that almost always means you have to change the content that you're into. People only move in one direction when they consume pornography. They get more and more degenerate because they've got to titillate themselves more. And so, yeah, there are people who that I've talked to regularly say the stuff that they first encountered, they don't look at that anymore. And the stuff that they look at now, had they seen that when they first saw porn, would have made them sick. And so far have they degenerated and become desensitized that this just progressed slowly. I went to a really important seminar not too long ago, which was run by a psychologist who treats and works with prisoners who have been indicted for child exploitation material using internet child porn. And the guy said that the standard profile of people in these prisons are middle-aged married men who all report that they were never into child pornography to start with, but they got on the slippery slope and they got triggered and they ended down that pathway, and to the point where it's been devastating for everyone's lives. And so this is one of the massive traps and lies of this industry. It's not harmless. It's not static. It's moving in a direction, and that is to harm and to capture and ensnare the person who uses it. And people listening, there will be people listening who know this experience. They know how ensnaring it is, and they might feel quite helpless when they hear me say
Yeah,
that.
I really want to get to the solution because I know you've got some very practical helps. But before we do that, I just want to talk a little bit about, and I think this is really important, particularly for this podcast. You talk about the personal ramifications. You talk about the relational ramifications. You talk about the broader community or societal ramifications. Can you just, you're also an ordained Anglican minister, right? Can you talk about the spiritual ramifications of pornography use?
Sure. I mean, great question. And surprise, surprise, there's serious ramifications. The spiritual cost to anyone who engages regularly with porn or is approving of porn is serious and dire. The bottom line is it is the absolute opposite to love, the activity of porn. It is the complete opposite to love, which means it's the complete opposite to the nature of God.
Yeah, unpack that for us, Marshall. Why is it so opposite to love?
Well, the whole porn industry is predicated on personal benefit at someone else's expense. But God, embodied in the person and work of Jesus, showed love that was emptying of all value of oneself for the benefit of others. And we saw that he came to give his life as a ransom for many, says Mark 10. And so they just can't coexist. And so what happens with the person who is debilitated privately with a porn addiction is that they have to sever their heart from the Lord. You can't partition ultimately your life so that you can coexist on one side with this habit that doesn't interfere the others. In the end, you're a walking hypocrite. Your zeal and your single-minded, wholehearted determination to love and obey Jesus can't exist. And therefore, your ministries will suffer. The way in which you engage with your family will suffer. The way in which you see people will suffer. You will invariably objectify the people around you as well as yourself. But that will especially flow onto those who are most susceptible to that objectification, which is young females. And ultimately, you're a behavior risk as well, because behavior does change for someone who's a high porn user. And so this is even a ministry safety issue.
Just on that, I've heard it said that the dopamine levels and the hormonal addiction is similar to a drug addict, right? Is that true?
Yeah, they've taken brains of porn addicts and they've scanned them under MRI machines, and they put them up and compared them to meth addicts and cocaine addicts and alcoholics, and they look the same. The structural brain changes are very similar. The restriction and shrinking of the prefrontal cortex and grey and white brain matter is observable, and the hyperactivity in the limbic system, which is the pleasure center, changes as well to look similar to those other substance addictions. So yeah, it is actually a biological, a physiological effect, not just a spiritual effect. But that said, at the end of the day, we talked about this, when we've got something which is so deeply unloving, I mean, another phrase, because we call it just sinful, right? It's opposed to all things God. It's not just disobedient to him, but it's opposed to every fabric of what he's instilled in image bearers of his and how we should engage with this world. And so what else do we need to say about what flows from that? We aren't self-controlled. That's a massive dimension of being Christian. It's a fruit of the Spirit. It was Jesus embodied perfect self-control, and that's we're called to. And there's many, many places across the New Testament where we're called to improve in self-control. So it flies against the face of that.
Yeah, I guess fundamentally, really, it's an act of idolatry or false worship, isn't it? It's something that's driving our heart. And I've heard you say in a seminar that no one can serve two masters.
Yeah.
Either hate the one, love the other, be devoted to the one, despise the other. You can't serve both God and mammon, But I could imagine there'll be people hearing this and they just feel crushed, they're even condemned of thinking, well, there's no hope.
Yep.
I'm under the weight of this. I really want to hear, what would you have to say? Because I've heard you say this, and I'd love for our listeners to hear this. What's the gospel hope here and the practical way out? Can you outline that for us?
Sure. I mean, Christ came to die for sinners. And if you're feeling the weight of this in your life, or even shame about your past, that's a good thing, right? That tells us that actually you want deep inside to be restored to wellness spiritually and in affirming your discipleship following the Lord Jesus. And that's a good thing. If you are utterly indifferent to this, that would be my big concern. Now, inasmuch as many of us who have had this struggle, and, the average age of first-time exposure is 11 and a half, but I know people who've been exposed since 5 or 6. Some were abused, and this is where it all started. It lived with them all through their adolescent years, in their 20s, sometimes 30s. I met a man in his 60s. He said he hadn't had a day of his adult life where it hadn't been a burden on him. And it was through the course that I wrote, and I'll talk about later, where he finally got some freedom. Some of you listening will know that this is the idea of hope feels so far away because you've tried to change and it just keeps coming back. And I want to assure you that that is not a static situation for you. There is real hope. Jesus is in the business of change. And so I would love to give you some tips before we finish to give you some pathways forward. But I do want to warn everyone in this, whether you're going to be supporting other people, whether you're a leader who wants to think more systematically in your church how to address this, or whether it's a person trying to recover themselves. It's not a quick fix, right? That generally speaking, when we talk about behavioral addictions and spiritual blackness, we're talking about an array of challenges that will take time to move forward, but we definitely can move forward. And I've seen so many people liberated who never thought they had a hope.
Just on that, can I just interrupt you for a second? Because I was at a conference the other day of which you were speaking, and one of the most helpful things I think a lot of people took away from that conference is this point, and that is a lot of people think, oh, I've tried to stop, I've been successful for 3 weeks, and then I fell. Oh, it's useless, you know. Whereas you sort of stepped out, really there's a 3-month process, which is in 3 stages. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yes. So if we just want to talk about trying to get over the cravings of an addiction, and that this is definitely part of what we're dealing with here. There's a real genuine addiction going on, and it is got to do with neurology. It's got to do with hormones. These things are observable. So armed with that knowledge, we can at least start to apply some of the knowledge in the neuroplastic change sphere and adopt that for our process forward.
Yeah, just on that, you're saying the neuroplastic is that our brains are quite like plasticine.
Yeah.
They're malleable.
They can change.
Mm.
That's plastic means it can change. And the brain's developed over time to be in the state that they are now, where they're compulsive and where at any sort of displacing trigger, your brain wants to default to that one behavior. The neural pathways are deep and reinforced. And dopamine's the big player in why that got there. It is the hormone that generates the new neural pathways. There's actually a little brain protein called delta FOSB, which they've worked out is a pathfinder that actually responds to dopamine and creates these new neural pathways, just so that you fast track to repeating those behaviors. It's a way the brain says, hey, I know I see you keep liking this sort of thing. Next time you feel stressed, well, let's not think about it. Let's just go straight to it, right? Mm-hmm. You get single-minded and you do lose interest in other things. But it's actually that dopamine process which is also the key to changing. So what we don't want to do is just say to someone, stop. It's like saying, you've got this massive part of your life, we're going to dig it out now and leave a big hole there. Well, the moment something displaces you, you're going to fall into that hole again. And if you don't return immediately to that behavior, you'll replace it with something which is just as cheap and unhelpful. What we do need to do is we need to intentionally and carefully replace that hole with a new activity, with new things which are wholesome, things which do stimulate dopamine but reward and have purpose. And so at a very base level, I encourage people to take on hobbies and other interests and practice them, invest in them. It can be really exciting. The sky's the limit for what this can be. But what you're doing is that you're not just starving your brain of access to the negative behavior. That they say, and it's different for everyone because it depends on severity and circumstances, but rough as guts, it's about 30 days to lose your cravings.
Okay.
All right. So that's a bit of work. A lot of people never get to the 30-day mark. It takes some preparation, takes some sacrifice. It is uncomfortable.
But it takes some intentional planning there, right?
A lot of intentionality, a lot of planning, a lot of management planning, and a lot of help. So accountability is very important because you need support in this. It's not easy. But after the 30 days of losing the craving, if you've been at that same time working on some new things, some enjoyable things, noble things, honorable things, like Philippians 4 says, the things to dwell on. It's like that's still going to take another 30 days on top of that to lay down the new neural pathways so that your brain suddenly has new interests to default to. Mm-hmm. And that takes roughly another 30 days or up 3 months to flip the brain so that when you're under those times of stress, tension, or trouble, you would default to the new thing and not feel the craving to return to the old thing. Mm. Now, this is a very simplistic way of looking at it, but it is effective. It doesn't take into consideration more complex issues related to the individual. For example, you might have a lot of other challenges in your life, traumas in the past, and other issues which are going to need more than just a simple method. You're probably going to need some good therapy, some good self-awareness, maybe some medication, maybe some help. to understand yourself and to be able to deal with those other things.
Yeah, just on that, can I again just interrupt quickly, because it seems to me, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this. How much do you find that pornography use, for example, and I want to talk a little bit about other ways of accessing dopamine, whether it be computer gaming or just death scrolling, doom scrolling
Doom scrolling on
the Facebook,
Instagram
or
and whatever.
But how much of that is masking maybe deeper emotional problems? And so when people start to detox, go cold turkey off their dopamine addiction, whatever form it takes, whatever means they're accessing, do you find that all of a sudden a lot of people are like, oh, wow, I've actually got some unresolved anger or disappointment over here? Do they need to be ready for that?
I think people do need to be prepared and ready to find that. That's why I definitely want to spend some time with a professional therapist. So I'm not a therapist, but I know good psychotherapists and counselors and experienced people there will be very helpful at getting you to understand yourself better and see if there are those issues. Historically, according to the research, it was very common, in fact, typical, that a person who had a problematic porn behavior did have these underlying other issues. It was comorbid with other issues. This day and age, that's less so, mainly because more and more people who develop porn addiction aren't turning to porn to escape anything. It just finds them and they get into the habit as a young schoolboy, and it just becomes a central part of their life. And so it within itself is the primary trauma. So, but everyone's going to be different. So it's good to get some additional input into understanding yourself as you move forward. But bottom line is, this is part of it. The behavior change can happen. Now, I can give that advice to a non-Christian, and they can be porn-free successfully for the rest of their life. But for a Christian, we've got a bigger story than here, right? Because we've got issues of reconciling with God, issues of learning faithfulness, issues of learning and practicing love and empathy for other people. And so our discipleship needs to grow at the same time. One of the big barriers for a Christian who's governed with shame is their fear of returning to the Lord. And that's the standard narrative is that someone has prayed, they've repented, they've tried, they return to the sin, and they feel God's so ashamed of them. Why would he want to hear from them again? They must be sick of all this apologizing. And we just go so cold and timid and distant from the Lord. And some work needs to be done here on that person's heart. They need to, and mind, because they need to be reminded this is not how God works at all. God came to us when we're at the height of our sin, and he loved us then. He certainly loves us as his children. He understands our vulnerabilities. He understands our past. He wants to change us. He's not sitting there with a big stick ready to whack us every time we walk away from him. He's patiently and longingly and lovingly calling us to him and letting him do the change process, which he knows we need, and he loves us anyway.
What do you say to the person that has fervently come to God, really prayed, and yet just feels like the temptation is beyond them? Now, there's lots of different reasons for that, but in your experience, what sort of response have you given to them?
Well, a couple of responses. Firstly, it's not true. There's no temptation that's beyond them. And, I don't mean to sound lewd here, but I do talk frequently with teenage boys about masturbation. A lot of them will say to me, I can't survive without it. They're very overt and discussing this current generation. Back in our day, we would never talk about this stuff, right? But everyone talks about it now, right? This younger generation. So their feeling is that this is something I've got to have in my life and I can't go without. And I just say to them straight off, that's not true. Because if you are having a session and your mum walked in on you, you're not going to keep going. You're going to stop straight away, and they all uncomfortably snigger and think, yeah. And I say every time you see an attractive person out there in the public, you just don't suddenly exercise your personal liberty and pleasure yourself. And they know that too. We actually have a lot more reserves of self-control and restraint in situations. So people need to call out the impulse for what it is, and it's only an impulse. You don't have to act on it. You have a choice there. So that's the first thing. And the other thing I want to say to them is that often the sensation that the impulse is uncontrollable is aided by the circumstances for which and when they're feeling it. So if the opportunity is there and there's nothing stopping them from taking the opportunity, it's much more accessible. Well, it's going to feel like it's unavoidable. But if you can't go to the internet at the time that you have a impulse because you've got, say, some software on your phone that's stopping it, or there's no devices around you at the time, or there's people around you and so forth, all of a sudden that really immediately diminishes that urge and that craving because it's just not possible. Now, over time, you adapt and you learn and you change, as we've already been talking about. And so those impulses do reduce, but you've got to give it time and give them patience. So there is definitely hope there. And if we couple the reconnection with God's grace, reconnection with his leading, immersing ourselves in his word, in his fellowship with his people, praying, and filling our minds with his good purposes while starving ourselves from the negative, dark, evil, bad stuff, the change happens a lot faster than people realize.
Yeah, it reminds me, I think, as you've been talking about, the passage in James 5 about having the humility to confess your sins to one another, praying for one another that you may be healed. That's a key component in this, isn't it? Accountability.
Absolutely. Accountability and group work. So I'm a big believer of people not holding this onto themselves. I talked about some circumstances aid this, and one of it is secrecy. So if you feel this way, please, let's just tell someone. Tell a trusted mentor, tell a leader, tell a friend. Let's get it disclosed. Let's not hold on to it as a secret. Let's share it, share the load. And you know what you'll find, particularly if you get involved in one of the recovery groups that I promote, that there are many people who are in exactly the same place as you. You're not alone. 70% of Christian males in churches across our land are struggling with this issue. That means only 30% are not. And 20% of girls are struggling with this. 1 in 5. That's harder for females to disclose this willingly. I mean, there's reasons for this, but feeling more of a minority aids that. And this is why I probably should just have a little bit of a divergence here and say to that 30% of males and the 80% of females for whom pornography itself is not an issue, I want you to hear that you have a massive role to play in the lives of people around you. Like, we're still talking about a significant proportion of our overall church congregations have this active burden. Like, it's not a minuscule amount. And we need to carry each other's burdens, says Galatians 6. We need to carry each other's burdens. And you have an obligation, in one sense, as a Christian, to help those who are helpless to get through their challenges here. So it's not just a case of you want to keep being vigilant in your own life, but where and how you hear that someone else is struggling with this, and it may include inviting you to run some of these programs yourself and get more actively involved with them. But where you see that they've got an issue, you have a primary chance here to lift them up, to help restore them, help change them, and help insofar as you achieve this, bless your church, which will, of course, bless you and your family as well, because we're all in this together.
I think there's a timely word there too. I think of Galatians 6 where Paul says, carrying each other's burdens, and he says, but when you do, watch yourself, that you yourself are not tempted.
Yep.
So there's a real temptation, I think, here for self-righteousness or even judgmentalism.
Yep.
But it really is the case, isn't it? But for the grace of God.
But for the grace of God.
Just to go back a little bit, because I think we're talking very frankly about these things, I think there'd be some Christians that would say, okay, porn's bad, but masturbation is like, I don't know, a solution or to prevent going down this path. What would you say in response to that?
Well, look.
Are they connected?
They're connected, but they aren't the same. The vast majority of people who engage with pornography do it to the end game of masturbating for pleasure. So that fits hand in hand there. And really, very, very few times will people masturbate without a fantasy of some sort in their mind to trigger the imagination and get themselves thinking in that arousing way. And so even if it's not pornography, the Bible does say things about lustful thoughts. which we want to pay attention to. Now, I should just say I'll give you a couple of websites at the end of this so that people can look up some further. But on the resistporn.org website is an excellent masturbation paper that people can read. It's good theologically and good practically. People don't need to masturbate, and you can survive. No one's died from failing to masturbate, right? So firstly,
But many in the world, I think, would actually say, "Oh, it's what you're saying right now is harmful. Like it's impossible."
Some will say that, but I don't think there's a medical doctor in the world who will say that you need to do this. At any rate, what we do know as Christians is that Bible is in the Bible, sex is an enormously rich and lavish gift to the world. It's one of God's best, and He gave it. It's so powerful and so wonderful, so potent at uniting people together that He really put it in a special domain to preserve it and preserve the people who use it. And that's marriage. That's Matthew 19. And so that's why the Bible is so protective of healthy sexuality and why God gets so miffed when we abuse it. So whether it be Hebrews 13:4, which says, honor the marriage bed and keep it pure, and we both uphold the significance of marriage and the marriage bed, which of course is sex, and we acknowledge and understand that God takes it very seriously when we misuse it, because when we misuse it, what comes with this is the misuse of people, and He doesn't like that. But a little bit more deeply, we know from Romans 1 that ultimately where people indulge in lustful thoughts and sexual behaviors, it's a symptom of idolatry, which you kind of touched on before. And it's a function of rejecting God and replacing Him with something. So interesting, all the ancient world religions have sex at the center of them. And it was certainly one of the prevailing challenges for the Gentiles in the New Testament, let alone the Israelites in the Old Testament, the neighboring religions. It was how seductive they were because sex was always central to their worship. And it's no surprise that wherever we've replaced God and put sex on a pedestal, it ends up being like a alternative God. This is exactly what we see today in our world now, even though we are so secular and even atheistic in social thought. We function and defend and celebrate sex as if it is on a pedestal or on a
Can I ask you another side question? Because you touched on this about pornography being also an increasing problem for women. Is it the same for women from your research, pornography use, as for men? And if not, how is it different? And how are they accessing it? What's the temptations for women that is different for men?
Sure. Well, when we talk statistically, right, we can see some common ground between men and women, but also some vast difference between men and women. And so not every female will be identical in her behavior and interests as the next female, nor the same for guys. But just on terms of averages and that sort of spectrum, there are some differences. In fact, when we examine the females who engage with pornography, only a minority of them actually interested in visual porn. So they actually, more often than not, enjoy story and
Like
imagination, fan fiction, erotic literature. That is much more prevalent for females than the classic Pornhub stuff. Visual porn tends to be uninteresting to them. Their sex act itself is less interesting on average to females than all the stuff that happens around it, including the engagement, the romance, and the imagination. But that doesn't mean that what they engage with isn't as addictive. It can be just as addictive. And so it just manifests itself in a different form of media. So one of the things about literature and erotic literature is that it's much more easy to stumble into before you're critical and realize this is unhelpful. And it's easier to hide. For example, when the 50 Shades of Grey phenomena hit about 8 years ago or thereabouts, I can't remember the dates now, but I first discovered that this was an issue when I was traveling to and from the city every day and noticed for the first time in ages a high volume of people reading on the train, because normally people don't read on the train, they look at phones now, but I saw all these women reading books on the trains and it got me curious, and I standing up in the middle because there was no seats, and I was looking over the shoulder of a lady reading this book, and I saw the title, 50 Shades of Grey, and I just started flicking my eyes down the paragraph, and I blushed. It was very, very explicit. And this is where I realized all these ladies were reading highly erotic stuff, and yet no one would have known. But if someone's got a screen open on the train looking at something X-rated, of course, the police would get called. It'd be very observable, and someone would respond. So there's a bit of a trap there that just because it's not so overt and obvious as sexual, that it's not just as dangerous for certain people. Everyone, it's in the end, it's very subjective. What pornography is for an individual is the media that arouses them, and that may be writings, may be pictures, or it may be paraphernalia like shoes or stockings, or might be bras and things catalogs, which used to be delivered in our mailboxes or things like that. So people need to know there's a spectrum here.
Yeah. Now, earlier on, we talked about getting dopamine from a few different sources. And it seems to me one of the big sleeper issues. I was saying this to you just last night. I think we were walking back from somewhere, and I said, it'd be really great to do some research on computer gaming. Can you just touch on this briefly? I know your area of research is it been in pornography, but is there a parallel problem here with computer gaming?
So definitely there's a behavioural addiction issue with a number of online behaviours. I'm part of the international behavioural addictions community and attend conferences there, and I see some of the papers that are emerging from around the research clinics in the world. So computer gaming is a massive issue for many countries, particularly amongst young people. And what computer gaming does was it taps into the same neurological functions as, for example, pornography, and the interplay between the limbic, the prefrontal cortex system. It's dopamine producing and highly addictive. And so in some countries, it's devastating for adolescent formation, for health in terms of socialization.
It's not a generalization, is it, to say that it's switching off your brain?
It does. As soon as you start pumping dopamine, as soon as you start spraying dopamine, your prefrontal cortex, its messages get blocked, right? So this is why we doom scroll. If people don't know what that is, it's when you're on something like YouTube or Facebook, Instagram, TikTok,
flicking up,
and you're going through those reels, right? And you look at one and you like it, you finish it, you don't, you scroll, and you keep going till you see things you like. Before you know it, like 40 minutes, an hour, 2 hours can just go like that, and you don't know where the time went. And that is precisely because your brain was getting sort of drip-fed dopamine in that time. And so this is how powerful it is. So social media is also a very powerful producer of dopamine, and it's highly addictive. So the average adult around the world right now spends 2.5 hours a day on social media. They make it to 80, that's nearly 7 years of their life just on social media. Empty dopamine production, empty dopamine, cheap dopamine we call it. And the more that you look at certain things while you're enjoying that dopamine, the more your thinking and your behaviors will change, which is precisely why we have a high problem right now across Western society or everywhere where there's social media with teenage girls and self-esteem, depression, and suicide ideation. It's because with the advent, Jonathan Haidt's Anxious Generation is a great resource for people to read. I'd certainly want to flag that book as a
I've heard you also quote from Dopamine
Dopamine Nation is another one as well. So there's a lot of research here to support this, but we just know now that the studies are clear. Self-promoting social media, so that's like Instagram and TikTok, Facebook, Snapchat, which girls engage with a lot more than guys. Guys are slightly different in their behaviors. That generates self-worth issues, comparison issues, changes their narrative about themselves. They objectify themselves. It balloons depression, anxiety. It's having a terrible health cost. So yeah, the addiction there is just the same. And the other big one in society is gambling. Gambling taps in on the same sort of mechanisms as well, which is why poker machines in any club and pub are just full of bells and whistles and highly engaging. And you talk to those who are pokey addicts, they talk about when they get into the arena and they hear the sound or get the trigger, the dopamine turns on and they just can't stop themselves. They've got all self-control disappears once the dopamine starts. And so they fire dopamine. Big tech who give us those apps that we talked about for social media, they fire and intentionally go for dopamine. The porn industry does the same as well. And gaming computer gaming is all about dopamine. So this is the issue, and it flows on beyond just the one issue we're talking about today, pornography. All these issues are a problem. If they get in the way of you wholeheartedly following Jesus, or another way of saying this, if the Lord doesn't rule that aspect of your life, if he's not the ruler of it and something else has control over you, then that's a massive problem as a Christian, and it doesn't belong there. So when Jesus says you can't serve two masters, this is the sort of thing we're talking about here.
Jesus also talks about, if your right hand offends, cut it off. Better to go through life maimed than with two hands and go to hell. It's really confronting and very clear what he's saying. How have you seen that, or how would you encourage people to apply that biblical truth to their lives?
Well, the hyperbole that he uses at that time in Matthew 5, I don't think we're to take that literally, but what he's saying is that we should take it seriously. If something is getting in the way of us and God and we're sinning, we've got to take serious action. And this is certainly supported by all the research. And so when it comes to porn, for example, or social media, don't think you could just wean your way off this stuff. You've got to be clinical and brutal, and you've got to deal with it hard. And this might come at a cost for people. And so it might come with your freedom or a loss of other pleasures. And if you're dead serious about following Jesus.
Give us some examples practically that you've seen that
All right,
people have taken.
So some people use their phones for multiple purposes, some for work, some for entertainment, some for porn, right? If the phone's the trigger and means that you having a smartphone is just putting you in the line of problems, and you have to say goodbye to that smartphone, and you won't be able to watch Netflix on the train or listen to Spotify or things like that, that's a cost. But it's definitely worth the cost if you're serious about having a wholehearted discipleship.
Okay, so we're talking now about solutions.
Yes.
And I'm thinking there's two types of people that are listening in generally. Obviously, there could be more. There's two types. Number one, the person that's really struggling and wants help.
Yes.
And number two, person that's not struggling but wants to help.
Yes.
What advice do you give to both?
Well, I want to return to the community aspect, and churches are a brilliant arena for this. We need to help each other corporately. It's certainly part of the biblical paradigm for change. We cited James 5 before and Galatians 6, and this is part. We are corporately the body of Christ. We speak the truth in love together. We build up each other into the head of Christ. So we want to deal with these issues corporately. And if you're a person who's trying to change and break free from these enslaving behaviors, you need to hear that it's going to be much better for you that you do this with others than on your own. So I want to encourage people to participate in some group work. So I have my course. It's called Resist, and it's a 5-week program that balances theology, practical research, and also good information to carry people into that fast pathway.
How much does it cost, and where do you get it?
At the present, it is free to use, and to get it, someone connected with your church needs to sign up to be a facilitator. It doesn't have to be a minister. It could just be someone who's an enthusiast or a Bible study leader or someone like that. And the resistprogram.org website, resistprogram.org, has a sign-up section there, and people can do that, and then you get access to the resources. All the teaching content's provided. The workbooks are provided. It's all downloadable.
What if they'd like to talk to you either personally or maybe even get you to come and speak at their church, hold a seminar? How do they go about that?
So they can contact me through that website as well, the same way. So I'm very happy to help and guide people into some practical steps for themselves in their own context. Not everyone's the same. And so obviously I can't be a counsellor for everyone in the country, but I do my best, and I'll forward them on to the people who can help them. So that's the first thing. Now, if someone who's not got a porn issue but wants to step up forward, I'm going to say these things. I think what would be very helpful is that you let the leaders in your church know that you want to make a difference here, so that they identify you. Because in the end, if we want to get some systems going in the church where we provide large avenues for help, we're going to need more than just a vocational worker to do this. We're going to need some volunteers who are passionate and can put some time into those others, and that you'll be champions of this. So likewise, contact us through the resistprogram.org site, and we can talk about that further. But in the end, even when it comes to doing the resist course, some people feel that, well, I haven't got a porn problem, so this is not something I shouldn't do. I want to say, actually, everyone who does this course, even if it's not an overt problem for you, benefits from it. In fact, I've run it over 20 times now, and I still benefit from it, because when we go through the behavior change exercises, I always put into place something in my life which I think would be helpful to improve on, whether it be my habits or my tidiness or my language or my time management. And I actually set up, parallel with those in the course, my own efforts to
and
change.
It's a 5-week program.
It's a 5-week program. It's not long at all. Yeah. And so everyone will benefit from it. But also, if we really want to understand those around us, we've got to get our information up as well. We've got to understand what it's like to be them, and let alone how we can best help them change. We just don't want to be distant judges, and we don't want to be indifferent.
All right. Well, Marshall, we've covered a lot. I want to ask you one last question, and that is, there'd be a lot of parents watching this, maybe with young children, and I can imagine just the fear of thinking, I don't want my child to ever have to struggle with this. What advice would you give to parents? I guess particularly practically. Maybe it's about, the age of when a smartphone is appropriate. Over to you.
Fantastic question. And look, all of us parents are daunted by this ever-expanding technological world, which our kids seem to be 10 steps ahead of us at every time, and it's not easy. But there are some great things that we can put into place that can make a difference. More broadly, before we think about actual technology and rules and things like that, what we all need to know is that where parents are proactively engaged with the issues and with their kids' lives and talk about sexuality in a good paradigm for relationships, this makes a massive difference to the way your children are going to start to think and act, even when it comes to their peer groups growing up and getting through adolescence. So you have a protective dimension there just by the way in which you actively and regularly engage. I encourage you to upskill on how to have conversations about sexuality with your children. Patricia Wirakoon's Parenting by the Book is a good start. The eSafety Commission has some resources there as well. Secondly, I want to encourage parents to actually put some hard barriers before their kids regarding access to technology at a younger age. We don't want them to have unfettered access, and we want to be able to account for everything that they see and when they see it. They don't need a smartphone in Year 6. If they need a communication device for practical reasons, we still can use the dumb phone. Nokia has the modern version of the brick, which takes 5G chips, doesn't hotspot, and is very practical for that. They can text on it, slow way, of course, like we all used to have to. But at any rate, that's the solution for phones. But more importantly, there's some practical things at home that they can add to boundaries. So, for example, when and where they look at technology. Never in the rooms, never in bedrooms, never in bathrooms, always in public spaces. Has to be a non-negotiable. In my family, I practice that with my family. I only look at my devices in public places as well to be consistent. So you might want to think about your own habits on social media, for example. Do you need to cut back on your behaviors? Do you need to make sure you're leading by example? And then lastly, don't be afraid to say no to your children. Understand what they can see and what they can't see, what they can do, what they can't do. Have your boundaries and enforce them. A lot of parents are in fear that a fight with their kid will be the end of their friendship, but the studies show consistently that the quality of the child's and parent relationship do not decline when you have a fight about technology. On the contrary, it gets stronger because they feel more secure and their well-being factors go up. They become more empathetic, they're more inclined to obey rules, and their self-esteem gets stronger. And they become more emotionally stable when parents actually have barriers and restrictions. So be encouraged. And lastly, just for help, there are various apps that you can put on your devices to help filter. So from Covenant Knives, Accountable to You, Custodia, which used to be called Family Zone, Bark. There are 4 that I've just listed. All of them can be used. Most of them, parents can have their own portal and control their child's device from their own phone so that they can limit when and where they're on. So there's some practical steps you can do in real time. And all up, if you just robustly keep in touch with where the kids are at, what they're thinking and what the technological environment is like, you'll have a much higher chance of preventing negative behaviors in your children and increasing positive well-being.
Okay. Wow. We've covered a lot. Thanks so much, Marshall. It's been great to have you with us.
My pleasure. All the best, everyone.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed this latest episode of AP's Profiles in Christian Living. It's a huge topic. Again, if you want to get more information, you can visit resistprogram.org, where you can get all the resources as well as contact Marshall directly. My name is Mark Powell, the convener for the National Journal of the Presbyterian Church of Australia, and I look forward to seeing you next time.